So in this discussion, let's talk about the flashpoints of the U.S. Constitution. We're 200 years in. What things should we be looking at now as we move into the future? What are the concerns?
As we've tried to establish in our conversations, the Constitution is a living, breathing document, and each generation has to think of it according to its own value system and the technological opportunities and the demographics and so on, that there isn't a final settlement of the Constitution. It needs to be reinterpreted for each generation. And this generation, the beginning of the 21st century, is going to put some real strains on the Bill of Rights particularly. But let me back up and think of what's generally coming. The rights tradition has been steadily expanding from the Magna Carta until today. You know, first it was aristocrats, and then with the American Revolution it became all white males essentially who were part of the social compact. And then there was the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which brought black men into the mix. And then you had the Women's Suffrage Amendment, and at the end of the 20th century, we were beginning to ask ourselves questions about things like trees. Do trees have rights? Do animals have rights? But we had basically widened the rights tradition until it covered just about every human being. But as the 21st century begins, questions, same-sex marriage. Do you have a right to marry the person of your choice, irrespective of the moral codes around you? Polygamy is probably going to be an issue in the 21st century. Is there any rational reason to limit a person's number of marriage partners? There are plenty of people who think that this is a moral fossil, but from an equal protection clause point of view, there's no real reason to decide how many people one can marry. And as you know, in many other societies, polygamy has been standard.
Well, it's also interesting that in the sense that divorce has become so prevalent in the 21st century, that the idea of having one partner for life is not there for more than 50% of the population. Therefore, if you're going to have multiple husbands, wives over a period of your lifetime, is there a reason you shouldn't have them at the same time beyond moralistic reasonings?
If you only used a rational test, it would be hard to decide how many marriage partners are sufficient. So the rights tradition has widened out. And even though there are setbacks, there are times when there's a kind of conservative backlash. Generally speaking, there's no stopping this, and we are probably going to reach the point in the 21st century when whales have standing, dolphins have standing, frogs have standing, and that their rights will be legally protected, not at the same level of humans, but in some significant way. So that's something I think we can expect to see continuing.
And we already have that in terms of endangered species.
A handful of species have been selected out because they're near extinction, and they therefore have government protection. And again, the enforcement power depends on the administration that happens to be in power and the will of the American people. But we have decided that there has to be a legal way to protect certain species, otherwise they would simply become extinct. Not everyone agrees with that, but that's part of not only American jurisprudence, but international law. So that's been one of the most interesting subjects in the history of our Constitution. When James Madison wrote it, it was really protecting the privileged elite. And through a series of spasmodic adjustments, including a civil war, extended more broadly every generation until today, it's something like a universalist document.
Well, let's pick on some specifics here. Well, let's start with what's most at risk, what's most relevant?
Well, what's at risk? Privacy. You know, the electronic surveillance of the world, from satellite technology to chips that can be embedded, to infrared, to listening devices, to the digitization of all knowledge and communications. You might be having a cell phone conversation with your friend, and it can be deliberately surveilled by a government or a corporation, but it can also be inadvertently picked up. And once that knowledge is out, it's hard to take it back. Well, let me give you another example. This is sort of the digitization capacity of the internet. Let's say that I go to my doctor, and he discovers that I have diabetes or a heart condition. That goes into my medical records. I then go a year later to a bank, and I want to get a mortgage. The banker routinely types my name in to do kind of a Google check or a credit check. And somehow there's been electronic bleed through, and my medical records are available to him or her. I'm now denied the loan because they know, even though they're not supposed to know, that I have a medical condition that may make me a mortgage risk. And Sam, you see these situations where somebody in the Social Security Administration goes home with a laptop and 20 million records are suddenly outed or lost. In Britain, there have been some scandals in which public records somehow wind up in private hands. Once you digitize knowledge, it has a travelability, a mobility, a permeability that you could never have anticipated in an age when things had to be put on paper. And this is going to be one of the great flashpoints of the 21st century. What is my privacy in an age when there might be a satellite over my head that's being used for to track a triathlon, and yet somehow it witnesses me doing something that's a crime. Government finds out about that, not directly, not seeking a search warrant. It just happens passively to find out about this. Now, what do you do with that kind of knowledge? How do you protect the individual in an age of digitization? This is going to be one of the issues that you hear about almost every week for the rest of your life.
It's almost to the point now where you have no expectation of privacy once you leave your house.
Yes, and people will say to you, every email that you write, every cell call you make, you should have in the back of your mind that somebody that you don't want to be witnessing it may in fact be in on it. That's a pretty anti-Enlightenment standard. The standard of British common law and the American Constitution was that a man's home is his castle, and that we have a reasonable, almost an absolute right to be left alone unless we do something that deliberately crosses a line that is an agreed upon line. And now, in the age of digital surveillance, we don't know where those lines are. You don't know who's following your credit card purchases. You don't know who is watching your email traffic. You don't know what websites that you're consulting are encoding somewhere else and can be used against you in different ways. Now, people will say if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't worry, but that's not the standard of the Enlightenment. The standard was you have a right to a very large zone of privacy, and what happens in that zone of privacy is nobody's business but your own. That standard is out the window.
Well, especially in an era of cell phones that can take video, and in an era of MySpace and Facebook, where people think that they are putting something together that can be viewed only by their friends, but then find later that employer, and this may be by the time somebody's watching this, old technology, but where a future employer can look at this and go, this is not the kind of person I want working for me.
Well, look at the Miss America and Miss Nevada scandals where, you know, the young woman goes out to a bar on some Saturday night 5 years ago and things get a little out of hand and a cell phone photograph is taken between friends. Suddenly she's sort of famous. Her boyfriend, who now hates her, outs her with some photograph that compromises her. I mean, that's a kind of a particularized case, but it has general implications for us all. But let me give you a much more chilling one. It used to be, I have a 13-year-old daughter, it used to be that if a sexual predator wanted to get to my daughter, he had to come through the front door. My home was truly my castle. Now, my daughter is in her room with a laptop. That same sexual predator is in my house. He has come electronically into the house. As a parent, I might be clueless about what's going on. My child might be innocent and not know what sort of a person that she's communicating with. He has gained access to my sanctuary through the electronic revolution, and there is no filtering system in the world that can keep him out. This has enormous implications for the security of our children and our families, and nobody has the slightest idea of what to do about it.
Here's a few questions to think about and discuss. Question 1. Do you think the Constitution is just fine as it is? Or do you believe there are places that need clarification as the 21st century begins? Question 2. The rights tradition has been expanding for the past 400 years. Should this growth in rights protection continue to widen, or has it reached its practical limit? Question 3. Should homosexuals be allowed to marry with the protection of the U.S. Constitution? Why or why not? Question 4. Do you fear the right to privacy is eroding in the electronic age? Question 5. Privacy is never mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. Does that mean we have no protected right to privacy?
In the old days, if you wished to view pornography, you had to go to a movie theater in a sleazy part of town. You could be observed. It was a much smaller industry. Then with the invention of the VHS, and then DVDs, and then the internet, pornography has become available to so many more people in the privacy of their own homes or in their hotel rooms. How does the Constitution view this?
Well, the Constitution is really perplexed about this because we have a culture in which we have decided that there is a very large First Amendment freedom for viewing of pornographic imagery and so forth. In other words, there's no practical limit on pornography for adults, including things that would shock not only your grandmother and your father, but you too. There is some protection about child pornography, but it's almost impossible to police this zone because if you've been on a computer lately, you can type in petunia and bring up porn sites. I mean, the pornographers are extraordinarily clever entrepreneurs, and they have found ways to infiltrate almost every Googleable subject. And so you can wind up searching innocently for something and suddenly a whole world of pornography unfolds before you. It's ubiquitous. I mean, one of the most extraordinary phenomena of the digital revolution and the late 20th century has been the universalization of pornography. It used to be that pornography was a thing that a small number of people had access to under very difficult conditions. Today, it's absolutely universal. And you've seen this, for example, in the mainstreaming of the pornographic industry, that porn stars are now frequently on mainline talk shows, they publish books, they have websites, they act in movies. They're normal. They've been normalized, and they're even cherished in a certain way as culture heroes. It's a strange phenomenon. The courts don't really know what to do about this because unless people are paying, it's not clear that they are observing. And so this is an area that will have to get settled. One hopes that this is like a Wild West moment for the internet and that this phenomenon will peak and then there will be some settling down of the pornographic world. But all the evidence points in the other direction, that pornography is just going to spread like wildfire, even more than it already has. Does this raise social questions? Of course. It raises some legal questions, but it fundamentally raises social questions. You know, what's the effect of the universalization of pornography? Pro-pornography people will say that it depuritanizes sexual culture and will actually lead to a healthier sexual culture. It's hard to think that that's true.
Let's talk about, as a flashpoint of the U.S. Constitution, campaign funding.
You know, this is one of those things the Founding Fathers couldn't have anticipated. You're a political realist. You know that money has always spoken, that wealth and privilege have always had a special capacity through the history of culture, and in no culture more than in the United States, because money is sort of our central way of seeing life here in the United States. But there have been some attempts to limit campaign spending on the principle that it distorts the process, that we're not really distilling the best people from out of our body politic. We're really investing in political solutions, and that money has not a magnifying effect on our politics, it has a distorting effect on our politics. So some political leaders have tried to get at this by passing legislation or the parties agreeing on certain codes that would limit the uses of money. But what we find is that whenever this happens, money and wealth just find another path. They're extraordinarily clever about finding whatever loopholes there are and working around them. And from a constitutional point of view, the history of the court has been that political campaign donations are protected under the First Amendment as free speech activities. If that's true, then there's nothing really that we can do except some voluntary restraint that would occur between the political parties. But if my donation to candidate X is free speech, and if a $1 billion donation to a political action committee is free speech, then the Constitution cannot get at this problem. And this is what frustrates people. We all know that we need somehow to get this problem under control. And when earnest attempts are made by smart people to do it, the courts generally step in and say, no, we can't allow that. Well, great societies, Jeffersonian societies, Sam, are ones that find the capacity to deal with the problems that they have to deal with. This happened in the age of Theodore Roosevelt, when our first national regulatory culture was being created, and the Supreme Court struck down bill after bill after bill and said, this violates the Commerce Clause, this violates this and that clause of the Constitution. And finally, there was a political sea change, and some of these pieces of legislation were declared to be, in fact, constitutional. But we haven't reached that point yet where the country will either pass an amendment enabling us to get at this problem or redefine our court interpretation to enable some reasonable limitation on this.
But what we've seen also is that when you dam something up, it spills over into another place.
Finds another path. And John Adams, who was Jefferson's very dear friend, but somebody who regarded Jefferson as a kind of a visionary, ungrounded in reality, Adams said to Jefferson in a famous letter, "The privileged will always get what they want." There isn't a world in which you can ever stop the privileged from having special access, special privilege, special power. You can legislate all you want. They're just way more clever than we are.
Abortion has been around since the beginning of time. We have seen over the last 50 years all the different changes that have occurred in this country as regards abortion. We have also seen how it has become very limited because of the dangers of practicing that medical procedure, that people who do that essentially have to live in bunkers as far as their workplace. Where do you see this continuing to be a flashpoint?
Well, there are two areas on this, Sam, and they kind of collide. Legally, it looks as if the courts are not going to overturn Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 case which enabled virtually abortion on demand. They're probably not going to overturn that directly, but I think we're heading in the early 21st century to more and more restrictions, that the window of opportunity for abortion will be narrowed. There will be more need for parental consent. There will be longer waiting periods. There will be more home rule in states to decide how much of this they're willing to have, banning late-term abortions, partial birth abortions, and so on. So legally, I think we're climbing down from the high water mark of permissibility that occurred in the 70s, 80s, and 90s towards a more restrained abortion culture. And a lot of it is on the 10th Amendment, that instead of the national government making these decisions, it'll be devolved back to the states, and Nevada will have one sort of standard, and Minnesota will have another, and California a third, and people will either move to those places or avoid them, but that there will not be a uniform abortion culture in the United States. That's the legal front. There is a possibility that Roe v. Wade will be overturned. If that happens, there will be a social cataclysm, because from a sociological point of view, abortion is now a habit of American life, whether we like it or not. The medical procedure is very efficient and well known. There is absolutely no chance that we will be able to stop abortion from being a fact of life in America. And President Bill Clinton, like him or not, I think had it exactly right when he said in America, abortion should be legal, rare, and safe. And I think somewhere in that nexus, we're going to find the abortion settlement. But there's the second problem, and that's the technology. In Jefferson's time, there were no surgical abortions. Through the late 20th century, surgical abortion was the rule. Now we're moving towards chemical abortion, morning after pills, chemical sophistications about reproductive control that mean that women in particular, are going to have much more autonomy in these areas, and some of this activity what amounts to a very early term abortion will occur without it being measurable by the police or by the medical community. And so it's the same thing about pornography and the same thing about the digitization of culture. We were in this period of sort of radical individualization and privatization of culture. And now a woman has more control of her reproductive system and her habits than she ever has before, and we're just at the beginning. The sophistication is going to go right through the roof. So whether any restraint can be shown on early term abortions will be a very interesting question. Probably not.
Here are some more discussion questions. Question 6. Should pornography be protected by the First Amendment? Question 7. A handful of U.S. senators can slow or stop legislation on virtually any subject. This comes both from the two-state compromise of the Constitutional Convention and the customs of Senate procedure. Should this concentration of authority be challenged? Question 8. Does the government of the United States have the right to set limits on campaign spending? The Supreme Court has essentially said no. Question 9. Is the Constitution an adequate instrument in the age of terrorism, or is it an admirable and quaint impediment to the war on terror? Question 10. Abortion is now currently protected by the U.S. Constitution. How should Americans decide what to do about this volatile issue?
So you write a song. In the old days, you had all kinds of protections for that song if you copyrighted it. Now what's happened to intellectual property?
Oh boy, nobody knows. This is one of the real issues of our time. The Constitution grants the creative people of the culture, writers and sculptors and so on, reasonable control over their intellectual property. Well, that made sense in an age when publishing was very difficult or the music industry was centralized and very expensive. But today, anybody, I mean literally anybody with a laptop can produce music or steal music. Once you digitize culture, protective bets are off. And so let's say that I publish a book, and it's the greatest book ever published. I hand it to you to look at. You type it in, you digitize it, and you publish it on the World Wide Web. I can never pull that back. It's gone now. I've lost control over it. I can't make money on it. I can't rescind it. It's out of my control. And so people who are interested in this line of technology and law are working day and night to try to find ways to create protections for intellectual property. It's not going to be possible. Wikipedia is one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the world. Wikipedia, the online user-created encyclopedia, is larger than any encyclopedia the world has ever seen. It's translated into virtually every language. It's self-correcting. It's ubiquitous, and it's only the beginning, Sam. So I heard a guy from Encyclopedia Britannica a few years ago saying, we're toast, because we have to pay authors to write these articles. Wikipedia is free. We can't sell a 50-volume set of encyclopedias anymore. Information is now, it's too cheap to meter. And so how are we going to create peer review, fidelity and truthfulness? How are we going to have the best experts involved in these projects when there's no revenue stream? That's true in book publishing, it's true in music, it's true in art, it's true in things like the photographs in the Library of Congress. If I get permission to use a photograph from the Library of Congress and I digitize it, suddenly it's on Google Image and nobody can any longer control its dissemination. Good news and bad news, but not particularly good news for singers, songwriters, or filmmakers, or writers, because digitization means loss of control.
But the good news is for the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur has every opportunity to take a new world and refashion an economic basis for that new world.
Oh, absolutely, and it's also, I mean, let's say that you are a one-hit wonder. You've got one little song you did in your garage, but you can't get a music company to produce you. You put that on the internet now, suddenly somebody from Sri Lanka downloads it, somebody from Australia, 20 people from Florida. Suddenly, in this digital way, you accumulate an audience. And so the networking possibilities, the possibilities for the obscure and the indigent to be as important as the most well-paid performer in the world. These are all breathtaking things that are going to be both good and bad for our society.
The war-making powers.
Now we get into a more dangerous zone. Our Constitution, Sam, was drafted by people who believed in Isaac Newton, balance, checks, separation of powers, and their view was, it doesn't really matter if much gets done because government is sort of an unpleasant entity. So Jefferson actually once said, between the first reading and the second reading of any national piece of legislation, there should be a year-long waiting period. You know, the Founding Fathers didn't want efficiency in government, just the opposite. They'd seen that. They wanted checks and balances. Well, that made sense when the Atlantic Ocean separated us by 3,000 miles from the rest of the world. Today, in a global age with cruise missiles and electronic surveillance and so on, we don't have the option anymore of that glacial pace of the Founding Fathers. So we need much, much more efficiency in government. Well, we're stuck. Senate, House, veto power, judicial review, the president has to sign. This whole cumbersome 18th century process is really a kind of embarrassment in the 21st century, and we cling to it because we don't know quite what to do about it. But because we're stuck with that structure, and yet we still need to do things, the president gets more powerful every single day. And the 21st century is going to see the creation of a presidency so vast in its power that it's going to terrify us, and it would absolutely appall the Founding Fathers. What's to be done about it? Jefferson would say, how about write a new constitution that tries to create a more efficient system, but with some checks and balances for the 21st century? That's not our habit. Our habit is to cling to that 18th century thing and somehow twist it a little so that it'll work in the 21st century. Maybe that's a good idea, but it gives the president so much power that it really puts us in a very weak position with respect to security of our rights and protection against tyranny. Well, Sam, those are just a handful of a long list of flashpoints coming. There will be church and state issues. There will be state-federal issues. There will be America's place in the international legal arena. All these things are going to be extremely important contested grounds of our Constitution in the 21st century. The simple fact is, we'll be 300 years out from the time when this thing was written, and that world is as different from ours as Mars is from Jupiter. So buckle yourself in. It's going to be a wild ride in the 21st century.